And there was another study that compared non-meditators to experienced meditators from inside tradition, American tradition, which is a sort of American version of Theravada Buddhism. And they were scanned during concentration, choiceless awareness, and loving kindness practice. And then the scientists looked at what is active in the brain when you compare those three states with just mind wandering. And again, they found that this default mode network, this midline posterior and midline frontal, those areas were deactivated. So this is kind of very interesting that in expert meditators who were not using effortful mindfulness, like in the slide before, because here people still have very effortful mindfulness, there were areas of the brain that deactivated compared to mind wandering, but there were no areas of the brain that were more active. So that was a little bit unexpected. And I'll talk about it a little bit more. But I also want to mention that this default mode network, this hyper self-referencing, thinking too much about one's personal self, we actually find it pretty much in every clinical condition, in every psychopathology. And it's interesting, as Buddha said, that our suffering is a result of our attachment to the self. And actually what we're showing with neuroscience is very similar. So in those people where this network, default mode network, does not deactivate, even when they ask to do a task or pay attention to other things, they have different conditions such as schizophrenia, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And mindfulness is very effective across all of these conditions. So just by bringing down the activity of this default mode network that we can do through mindfulness reduces suffering in these people who are caught up in their habitual patterns of thought. But the default mode network is not simply a bad guy that we're trying to get rid of through practice. And the reason for it is that when the default mode network areas become disconnected from each other, and they become disconnected from an area called hippocampus, which is responsible for our memory, formation of the memory, maintaining of the memory, retrieval of the memory, we get things like Alzheimer's disease. Would people be familiar with Alzheimer's disease? Yes, when we lose the sense of our identity, when we can't function anymore, when we can't retrieve the memories of the past that build our autobiographical memory. So we get an impairment in our function. So we don't want to get rid of default mode network because it's an important process, right? As a function, it's useful for us to have a sense of self when we move around or have to interact with each other. But it's when this network predominates the dynamics in the brain that becomes a bit of an issue, and sometimes quite an issue for people with different disorders. So as I summarize here, mindfulness practice weakens default mode network dictatorial regime over the rest of the brain of the body. And also with a lot of practices, I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but just to acknowledge with a lot of practices that generate positive thoughts, that generate gratitude, that generate appreciation, practices of loving kindness, we actually also engage this default mode network and we rewire it from worry, rumination, anxiety, self-obsession into something constructive, productive, that allows us to engage with others around us in a loving, compassionate, empathetic way. So I'm just using this picture, and I will paraphrase it a little bit. So a monk asking a teacher or master, is it proper for a monk to use, but instead email, I would say default mode network. And the answer would be sure, as long as there is no attachments, right? Okay, so what happens when we are at the stage 3, when the subject-object duality started to soften, and we drop and rest in a very heightened state of awareness, and which also has a very heightened state of energy in the body. In the insight tradition, the state is referred to as choiceless awareness. In the meditators that I study from Dzogchen and Mahamudra, we've translated as open presence. So there's it's very different from jhanas, I understand, because it's senses are very open. So it's not turning down the senses and resting in a very in a state of equanimity, but quiescence of the mind. It's a very open state. Anything can manifest. And actually, a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, John Dunn, has compared John Kabat-Zinn's practice of mindfulness-based stress reduction program, and they concluded that actually where they try to take their students, the end result they're aiming for is that kind of resting in that choiceless awareness or open presence. And what I want to differentiate is the brain would look very different between someone who's just practicing resting in open presence versus someone who's actually resting in open presence, right? Those are the networks that we've seen before. And I just remind you that we have this attention networks and this default mode network. So for someone who's resting in open presence, we would expect that neither of those networks should be activated, right? There shouldn't be a solid sense of self, and there shouldn't be much control of attention. At this point, the practice should feel effortless. And we would expect that the brain, because it's receptive to the external senses, will allow anything to come up from the bottom up. So it wouldn't be the prefrontal cortex controlling. Interestingly, there are no studies that I'm aware of expert meditators resting in jhanas, but I would expect that you wouldn't see much activation in what we call primary sensory areas, such as visual cortex, auditory cortex. So I'll just show you what we find in Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. So when they mind wander, we see so this is the slice through the brain in this orientation, right? Same network, but different slice through the brain. So this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. And this is this classical medial prefrontal cortex, and this is posterior cingulate. So we see the same kind of self-referencing network activating. Also, when we asked them to plan for the future, we saw classical activation at the front of the brain. This is only interesting as the fact that we see the network activations that we expect based on what we already know from science. Because this was the first time we really studied people who can rest in what we call non-dual awareness. So we didn't know what to expect, so needed to make sure that their brain looks normal in other conditions. So it does look normal in other conditions. So when they rest in this non-dual awareness, interestingly, we don't see any activity in the prefrontal cortex. We only see activity in the thalamus, which is a sensory gate to the frontal, the rest of the brain, in fact. So through the thalamus, we get information from our eyes, from our ears, from our bodies. So the thalamus is here. these two areas. And then we have insula on both sides, which is awareness of the body. So we have complete openness to anything that is coming from the senses and from the body, and no prefrontal cortex activation. Now, that might not be surprising to you, but it is very surprising. It wasn't surprising to me because I'm a practitioner for many years, and I take Buddha Dharma seriously. But a lot of my colleagues who come strictly from the Western tradition, their view is that consciousness arises from the brain, and that it's the prefrontal cortex, which is the most developed in us Westerners and evolved much more than in primates. That's the area that should be activated when we're in a state of consciousness. But if you think about it, resting in open awareness is, right, if you were neurologists, right, medical doctors who study people in coma, and I showed you this brain, you would say, oh, this person is not conscious. This person is in coma, right? Because you see this classical signature of only the bottom of the brain is active, but not what we consider to be consciousness areas. But in long-term practitioners, it's other way around. So the way I interpret it is that prefrontal cortex, of course, it's involved in high cognitive function. So we need it for abstract thinking, for writing a conceptual essay, a book. It's the area that it's like the sixth consciousness, mana consciousness, yes, cognitive consciousness. But when it comes to resting in this more non-dual awareness, when we don't need to engage our conceptual thinking or higher cognitive faculties, they can also rest. And therefore, we don't see these areas that we normally associate with consciousness. So that was a big surprise to our usual way of thinking. How am I doing with time? I also want to show you, because for you it's probably not a problem, but for a lot of practitioners in the West, they can understand how you can be mindful when you're sitting on the cushion, and maybe when you're walking, and maybe when you're brushing teeth. But when you're doing something that demands some cognitive action, some task, for them, then mindfulness becomes incompatible with what they're doing, right? Because I think the way Westerners are educated, we think we need to put a lot of effort into what we're doing, even when it's a small thing. So to relax into it and just be mindful of what you're doing, but carry on in the same way, is very difficult for Westerners. And actually, every time I go to the retreat with my Tibetan Buddhist teachers, probably one of the most common questions Westerners ask, but how can you do mindfulness, when you're doing something complex? So I've asked novice meditators and expert meditators, again, these are people who practice in Dzogchen tradition, to do a very simple task in the scanner. They were presented with digits from 1 to 9, and they were kind of flashing on the screen. And all they had to do is to say whether the digit was odd or even, right? So if it's 3, odd, 4, even, they just had to press the button. And it was a sort of self-paced task, so they can do it at their own speed. So it's not a very complex task, but it requires some attention. And as you can see, in novice meditators here, the brain is on fire. Although it's a very simple task, they're really putting a lot of effort into it. And we have the sort of classical frontal activation, really working hard. And the classical, the default mode network, I'm going to do this task well. I'm not going to make any mistakes, Probably having a running commentary and beating oneself up every time you make an error. Oh, I'm such an idiot, I made another mistake. And this is expert meditators doing the same task. And as you can see, hardly any brain is activated. the only areas that are active are the ones that are absolutely necessary for the person to perform the task. So it's visual area to recognize the numbers. There's area here which will judge whether it's odd or even. A bit of motor cortex, because they had to move the joystick for odd or even. That's it. The rest of the brain is resting. As I was presenting to at a Buddhist retreat, one of the people from the audience shouted out, "This is a solution to Earth energy crisis," right? Because if all of us were more mindful when we engage in various tasks, you know, and the brain consumes 40% of all our metabolic energy of the body. 40%. It's very energy hungry. And that default mode network, that selfing network, is one of the hungriest. It's about 20%. So one of the common experience for Westerners when they first introduced to meditation, and when they go to meditation retreat, they discover that they don't need to eat as much, they don't need to sleep as much, because there's a lot of energy release that is normally consumed by the brain on all this ruminative thinking about the self. And this is another interesting study, not from me, but from someone called Giuseppe Pagnoni. He's an Italian, and he's a Zen meditator himself, but also a neuroscientist. And he scanned his fellow Zen meditators, and he presented them with words, just words on the screen, and compared the brain activations during Zen practitioners processing the words with non-meditators. And again, you don't need to know the areas. All you need to understand on the slide is the activity of the brain in red from the language processing areas is from the experienced Zen practitioners, and this graph in blue is from non-meditators. What is remarkable, and you can see pretty much every graph shows it, that the brain registers quicker the word, and it drops it quicker as well. So there is no lingering, no attachment, no grasping, right? Saw, understood, gone. But in non-meditators, it takes much longer to register, much longer to process, and then let go. And there's often some kind of secondary association going on to the word. Yes, you can see it here. It's kind of processed, but then, oh, maybe it's some past memory came up in association with this word. But you don't see that in meditators. They saw, and then it's just gone. So that's right, yes. Yeah, this is a plot of, in fMRI, we don't actually measure neural activity directly. What we measure is so-called blood oxygenation level dependent signals. So the idea is that those neurons that are most active will require most blood. And when they consume the oxygen from the blood changes color. And that's actually what fMRI scanner detects, that change in the oxygen concentration in the blood vessels around the neurons. So what it shows is that this blood oxygenation signal rises and goes much quicker in meditators, right? So they're not like people in coma, they register things, but it doesn't linger that long, right? Because there is kind of no grasping, no identification. And in Zen, they have this wonderful metaphor, like writing on the water. So it seems like the brain of the experienced practitioners is like writing on the water. Everything is registered, but then it dissolves very quickly. So I'm going to leave you with the Buddhist compliment. I've never met anyone so thoughtless in my life. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Master. And I would like to thank you for your mindful attention, which I know wasn't easy after lunch. So if you have any more questions, I will be very happy to answer.
This is now for question and answer. If anyone has question, please raise your hand and introduce yourself briefly. Also, make your question to the point. A very short question.
Thank you, Dr. Antonova, for your wonderful lecture. I was a trustee when Mark Williams set up the Mindfulness Center at Oxford. So I'm aware of the MBCT and its work on depression as well. But I have not come across this. I have not read wide enough. Although I have been following like Rick Hanson and all those people that work. Rick Hanson from... Yeah.
Yes, I've read through Buddha Brain.
Yes.
I think it's a very ambitious title.
Yes, yes.
It's a beautiful cover.
Yeah.
But that book was written in 2007, before all of these studies become available. So actually in that book, Rick doesn't talk about default mode network at all, because it wasn't known yet how mindfulness practice affects it. And also, Rick Hanson, I kind of met with him a couple of times. He's a wonderful person and a very good practitioner. His knowledge of the brain comes not from neuroscience, but from something that we call neuropsychology. So the kind of constructs he operates with and the way he kind of modeled how attention works, how mindfulness works on the brain level is quite different from how neuroscientists now understand it works. And probably one of the biggest differences, I would say, and I had this conversation with him, there is this view that mindfulness practice, and maybe shamatha to some extent at the beginning does that, kind of rewires the body from the dominance of a sympathetic system to the activity of the parasympathetic system, which is more about relaxation. But myself and my other colleagues, we actually think that what happens with long-term practice is like getting the best of both worlds. And again, it's different for Asian people than for the Westerners. In the West, as you know, as you've spent a lot of time there, sympathetic system activation, which gives us alertness of the mind, the awake quality of the mind, also comes with a lot of anxiety. Whereas parasympathetic system comes with a lot of drowsiness. So what long-term practice, in our view, allows to do is to decouple sympathetic system to leave alertness but reduce the anxiety and bring forth relaxation of the parasympathetic system of the body without the drowsiness. Yes, so you have the best of both worlds. And I started looking more, I'm not so much interested in the brain anymore, I'm more interested in what's happening in the body. And I use a psychophysiology device that allows to measure heart rate variability and respiration. And I was in Bhutan in July.
For the conference?
For the conference.
I was invited, I couldn't make it.
We would have met there, because I was invited to present as well, which was wonderful. And I had an opportunity to test 3 Dzogchen yogis who live in the mountains. And much to my pleasure is not the right word, but to kind of my excitement for the first pilot data, I saw exactly what I was expecting. So normally, if even to an experienced practitioner who is a Westerner, if I ask them to rest in open presence, they often have predominance of a sympathetic nervous system. If I ask someone relaxed, normally an Asian person, it will be parasympathetic system. But when they were resting in kind of more open presence, you saw this kind of thing happening. So they were interleaving all the time. And that's for me was the kind of the middle path, between the two. So it's very preliminary, but I can't remember what your original question was. I went on an tangent.
I was just making some comments myself. Now, what I'd like to ask you to comment further is, okay, now you start working on the body.
Yes.
Can you say something, okay, about the connection between relaxed mode or tense emotion, emotionally tense people, and the nervous system?
Yes.
We have one, the professor of neurology is speaking here on the 14th. She talked about the brain and nervous system as well. Mm-hmm. But she didn't include mindfulness. She was just talking specifically on one point from the Abhidhamma. Not quite related to your theme. But now what I like to hear more from you is that with the nervous system throughout the body, how it reacts to the anxiety, the change of the mood and emotion, like that.
Well, this sort of autonomic and nervous system that I was just talking about, we definitely see that mindfulness at the beginning, if someone is very anxious, brings the activity of that sympathetic nervous system down, but eventually, yes, I was responding to your comment about Rick Hansen, that I think eventually the two need to rebalance, because I think if you're just resting in parasympathetic, then you're probably just in a drowsy state. So we still need the alertness of the sympathetic nervous system, and actually the open presence scans with the thalamus. Oops, sorry. So this area here, it's a part of what we call a kind of activating system. So when we wake up in the morning and we go from sleep to wakeful consciousness, the articular activating system that runs from the brainstem to the thalamus wakes the brain up, basically. But that activity is often compounded by the activity of the default mode network, which brings this anxiety and neurosis in the Western mind. So I think a lot of preliminary practices in Buddhism, they work to change what this default mode network responds to. So from negative states, from afflictive emotions, to more sort of wholesome states of the mind. And then from there, it's easier for us to start kind of resting in a more non-conceptual space. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm aware of the emotional states and some work, from the mind life.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question here. You mentioned the difference between Asian mind and Western mind a couple of times in your lecture. My understanding is it's not genetic.
I agree, yeah.
So if you were to compare, let's say, Western mind and Asian mind, not from the backward countries like Tibet or, Bhutan, but those from like South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan, I mean, they will be more like Westerners, don't you think?
It's an excellent question, yes, and thank you for correcting me, because actually, when I say Asian, my probably reference point is traveling in a lot of Asian countries which have Buddhism as their main religion, and where people are very soft and, their body is very relaxed. And there is I didn't include it, but it's an excellent study that proves your point. they compared Han Chinese with Tibetans, and they looked at the same default mode network. And as you know, in Tibetan culture, which is probably similar to here, they don't even have